there were moments when I felt like I could actually have a psychotic breakdown. Like this is just it was a really fine line. They were coming at one point every half an hour all day long. I had it
Mm.
bad. It's bad. But yeah, there were moments when I thought, I feel like I'm losing my mind. And I'm just sharing that because I'm so sure that there are other women out there who have this experience and they're terrified. They're like, am I psychotic?
Welcome to Wendy Goes Deep. I am Wendy, and today I have Michelle Dixon on with me. Now, I was fortunate enough to interview Michelle Dixon for my Women 2020 conference, and we've stayed in touch, but it's been a while since I've been able to go have a good, deep conversation with her. So I wanted to bring her on and see what she's up to and hear about all the amazing goodness that she is creating in this world. Because if you do not know her, you are missing out, because she is just an amazing human besides being an amazing practitioner. And so a little bit about Michelle is that she's a holistic practitioner with qualifications in many different modalities. She specializes in trauma, mostly working with adult survivors of child abuse. In addition, she mentors holistic practitioners in soul-led trauma healing, as well as conscious business and marketing skills. And she's also a writer. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Wendy. It's great to catch up.
I know. I'm so excited. Now, last time for Women 2020, we went deep into trauma and about, how to work with that. Now, probably it's going to be coming up because, it's you and me.
Yeah.
But I kind of wanted to go in a little bit about something that both you and I seem to kind of be going through, which is, as you get up in age as a female, your body changes.
Oh my gosh.
And while you might have been lucky enough to learn about hormonal changes as a teenager to prepare you as you go through, what's that transition called?
Puberty.
Thank you. I forgot the name. You might learn about puberty ahead of time, so you're kind of aware of it. But when it comes to like the reverse puberty, age, it just is like a little bit of a jungle. At least it has been for me.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay. So
we don't talk about it. Yeah, it's not talked about. So it was quite a shock for me when things started to happen, because I'm like, what is happening? Why can't anyone give me an explanation? What's going on here? It's normal. Yeah.
I started noticing changes in my period in particular, like just with not consistency with timing, but actually like the consistency of the blood. And I went to my doctor. I wanted to find out, like, how do I get this back in balance? And they're like, nothing's wrong. And I'm like, I've been having periods for 30 years.
Yeah. I think I know what my body does. Yeah.
I'm like,
yeah.
I was like, how can you tell me nothing's like everything's fine and everything's okay? I'm like, something isn't right. Like, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And they're like, oh, you're just getting older. That was it. Because like once the panel, came back, everything was okay. And
you do your test and they're like, you're normal, but you're like, something's changing. Yeah. For me, it was like anxiety. I suddenly got super anxious. I always track my period. I don't have periods anymore, but when I had them, I would track them on on an app. So I could see like, it's 28 days, 34 days. So they started getting really wacky, like 28 days, 50 days, 17 days, 28 days. And then like over a period of 7 years, I could actually look at my app and see it's like I had 12 periods this year, and then I had 10, and then I had 8, and then I had 4, and now I've had 0, But it's just aside from that, which is like the normal thing, I think, for me, it was just like suddenly I woke up and I felt like these like anxiety attacks, these panics in the morning, like this, and then like this rush of like terror and fear followed by a hot flush. And that was my clue. Like something's really not right. And that's the thing I would have liked to be prepared for, because it's really gnarly. Like just feeling like you just I've never officially suffered from anxiety. I mean, I've had like kind of emotional breakdowns when I've gone through really tough stuff in my life, like divorce and all of that. Like I've had like huge emotions and I've had periods where I've been super anxious, but this kind of anxiety was just like a lightning bolt. It was like suddenly I'm in full body terror and I don't know why. And yeah, it was challenging to say the least.
Yeah. I can relate a little bit to it. I have ADHD and I'm pretty certain that pretty much every human I know that when you have ADHD, like a diagnosis, it means that your symptoms, because everyone really is a little ADHD. And I know some people hate hearing that, but they're symptoms, right?
Yeah.
If your symptoms are drastic enough that you have to get a diagnosis, that's the difference between being a little ADHD. It's like you can be sad. Everyone's been sad. Everyone has
Yeah.
sadness.
Yeah.
And some
Yeah.
people are chronically depressed. That's the difference, right? What I do know is people who kind of have that diagnosis of ADHD where it's hugely symptomatic is that
Mhm.
there's a constant low at a minimum low level anxiety, but often
Okay.
super high level
Interesting.
anxiety that we live with all the time. So I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
necessarily know if it's because I've gotten older with age or not, because I pretty much have always had
You've
anxiety in
always
my whole
had
life.
a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for me, and I totally understand now that everyone's experience is so different. There are some commonalities, but so different. But the common thing with menopausal anxiety is that it's actually what's happening is that you have a rush of adrenaline because of often is like your estrogen is dropping, and so like your body is just like what's happening? You have this rush of adrenaline, and then this like sudden like flush of panic, like really intense panic, and then you get hot and then you have the sweats and then you have so that's usually the trajectory of and that's kind of how you know that it's hormonal is that there's usually those three parts. So usually if you any woman listening who has hot flushes, you probably will know when one's about to come on because you'll start to feel suddenly like, oh, I feel suddenly anxious or worried or concerned. And like if you track it, you'll go, oh, right, okay, here it comes. Yeah, that's it. Um, but I didn't know that, like, you know, 4 years ago. I just had this terror feeling. And there were moments when, like, to be honest, like there were moments when I felt like I could actually have a psychotic breakdown. Like this is just it was a really fine line. They were coming at one point every half an hour all day long. I had it
Mm.
bad. Um, it's bad. But yeah, there were moments when I thought I feel like I'm losing my mind, and I'm just sharing that because I'm so sure that there are other women out there who have this experience and they're terrified. They're like, Am I psychotic?" What I didn't because I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know to have it checked. I just thought, oh gosh, like, but I would now, go have my hormone levels checked, to go, see, whatever practitioner that you normally see and find out because it is on the spectrum of normal. You can feel like so disrupted. And that usually happens when you have like a really precipitous drop. So I think for me, whatever process might because I'm turning 50 in like 2 weeks. So my mother didn't go through menopause till she was 55. She had periods till she was 55, right? So this is young in my family history. So that's part of the reason I wasn't really prepared for it. I was thinking, usually, you kind of like your mother in that regard. So I was thinking, oh, I've got a few more years. But I think because I'd had a lot of stress in my 30s because of aforesaid crises, what happens, and you would know this, Wendy, like what happens when you're super stressed is that you're producing all this cortisol. And if you don't have enough cortisol, like your body starts to mine progesterone. So it actually can send you into menopause earlier. And there are a lot of interesting studies around. And I'm just disclaimer, as Wendy said, I'm just a practitioner, but I'm a human female bodied person who's gone through menopause. So that's my experience. I'm so not an expert, but I do enjoy reading all the studies. So, I can say that it is true that if you've gone through trauma, you might go through menopause earlier. Women of color tend to go through menopause earlier because of racialized trauma, for example. So, like, I do think that in my experience, it probably happened earlier because of all the stress I experienced in my 30s.
And I started having these symptoms in my late 30s. And they're like, oh, you're just going to be going through menopause early. Now, I'm still cycling. And it is because I started learning so much more about this.
Yeah.
It's not
Mm.
coincidental that as I started, this my practice of becoming an orgasm and neuropleasure coach and learning about how to, um, we've talked about de-armoring, multiple times, before, and I've told you about. Actually, you're very instrumental in helping me create my uni de-armoring course, by the
Oh,
way. Some
really?
of our conversations, yeah.
Okay.
Um, and it was, really kind of understanding what was happening biologically. And I was doing this for pleasure purposes because I was going on my own sexual, awakening,
Yeah.
figuring I'm not getting any younger. If I'm going to do it, I better do it now. One of those things.
Yeah.
But in doing so, I learned so much about, the impact of trauma on the body. And as I
Mm.
started healing my trauma, my periods came back better. And so,
Interesting.
yeah, and I actually have a couple clients that were in menopause that actually have reversed it through different practices that we've done. And it's so much of it is the healing practice because our bodies really are designed to, like menopause is a symptom that your body's too stressed to create new life. And
That is
it,
so interesting. Yeah, I wanna hear more about this. That's so
yeah.
interesting.
And so, yeah, I know like there's so many areas of this to
Mm.
go down. As someone with ADHD diagnosis, because the symptoms are drastic enough, it's tied primarily to dopamine, which a lot of people
Yeah.
don't realize that progesterone is a precursor to the production of dopamine. And
Ah,
so, yeah, so a lot of people with ADHD have a tendency to go to menopause earlier. And that's really because their
dang.
the dopamine production is, I mean, it's all tied together, right? So if you're making
Yeah.
cortisol, you're not making progesterone. And if you don't have enough progesterone, you can't make enough dopamine, right? So you start seeing how
Yeah.
there's this cycle, right? That you
Mm.
get into. But
Yeah.
once you start, you know, healing the trauma and doing all the things and like reduce your cortisol production, then your body can make more progesterone. And so
Interesting.
your
Yeah.
body is constantly taking from your reproductive organs because the natural cycle of estrogen and progesterone production that would happen like in your adrenals and your other glands isn't
Mm.
happening at the the level it needs to. So that's why it takes from the
Mhm.
reproductive organs. And it's the
Yeah,
same
I
with
mean
testosterone for guys, right? So
yeah.
if you're too stressed as a male, then your body's not making the proper amount of testosterone like naturally without your testes, right? And so
Yeah.
then it leaks from your testes. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, with men, there's a link between cortisol and testosterone then, is that what you're saying?
Mhm. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I totally get that, and I have definitely seen that as well. So that's really interesting because one of the things with menopause is I just mean
Like,
like conventional
well,
conventional medicine, the establishment, it's like what we know so far that's out there in the world that, the moment that you're officially menopausal, which officially is when you've had 12 months and no period, um, so you can't diagnose. I don't like the word to diagnose it because
mhm.
it's like a normal process. Like we're not meant to have babies when we're 80, so why, But so we can't diagnose it, but we can do tests on various hormones. But once you hit that official menopausal stage, your risk factors for all these different things go up and up and up. So it's actually then really unpleasant to go to the doctor because it's like, oh, okay, like you're not producing, FSH, which is the hormone that's telling you, do you have the communication between your brain and your ovaries to, are you dropping any eggs? No, the FSH levels, if they're really high, they'll tell you that your brain is constantly trying to get your body to release an egg. And it's like, no, we're not doing it. We can't do it. So, like, when this happens, then the very next conversation, not just for myself, but like all women I know who are at this age and stage is like, okay, now we need to start worrying about your bone density because but basically the way I understand it, again, disclaimer, not an expert, but basically estrogen is extremely protective of all of your body processes and your organs, right? It helps your liver detox faster. And so you could say without all of the estrogen from your procreational years, you're starting to see where maybe you could be healthier, that you've just basically been lucky and you've just kind of like you've kind of like got through it all because estrogen has been really helping you. And then without the estrogen, you're finally figuring out, oh, well, actually, like I have some toxicity in my body, or I have this or that. But so yeah, there's this thing of like, you don't want, I remember when I early on was getting these symptoms, I did a lot of acupuncture, which helped. And my acupuncturist was saying, like, we need to get your periods more regular. You need to keep going. And I was like, I'm so done. Like in my heart, I was like, I'm so done with, like, it's okay. I've birthed 3 children. I have 3 stepchildren. Like, I'm done. I want to not worry about pregnancy. I've taken up surfing. So like, it's great. I can go away and not worry. I can surf when I'm bleeding, but it's inconvenient, you know?
Yeah.
So I was like, I'm done. And she's like, no, you don't want to be done because there are all these protective things and your health is better. And so that's just remained a question mark for me because I know personally, I haven't quite got to 12 months yet of no period. I'm getting really close, but my FSH levels are super elevated. And I see an integrative practitioner, an integrative doctor who specializes in hormones. She's like, based on this, I'd be super surprised if you ever bled again. So I'm feeling like in myself, like for the first time, I'm not suffering from all of the whatever, right?
Mhm.
And I'm feeling like, okay, like I'm liking this feeling. I'm gonna just feel great and healthy. But what I'm being told is that all these things are gonna fall to pieces. So, yeah, I don't know. Do I want to have more periods?
I don't know. I like you.
Yeah.
These mixing. I've gone through different journeys with it for myself as well. So as someone who is out and about in the world experiencing many, many different
Many
things.
things. Yes. Yeah.
Um, the idea of not having to worry about getting pregnant is very enticing, right? And so there was a point in which I definitely was like, am I done yet? Am I done yet? Right.
Yeah.
Then as I started understanding a little bit more about what everything is. Now, part of the reason I did this, I had a client who was in her late 40s whose doctor said she's in menopause. And because she was already at 10 months and like, chances are you're in menopause, like just like
Yeah.
her
Like me,
numbers,
like
the
everything.
panels and all the things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so she was like, can you help me? Right. Because she didn't have a kid yet. She really wanted to try. She wasn't in a relationship yet. So she's like, you know, all the things, right? Like she was super successful business wise. She thought she was going to have plenty of time, as is the story for a lot of people. And
Mm.
so in trying to be like, let me see if I can find something that like people just aren't talking about, right? Because there isn't
Yeah.
just always there. It's
I
just
love
not all,
that. Yeah.
you know.
We don't know everything. There's always some weird way. Yeah.
Right. And so as I started like backtrack, like, okay, like, where's this? What's this? What's that? And kind of developing this protocol for her to get on. And I remember like she was on so she's going to be 50 soon. And she finally like kind of developed the protocol. I'll do it. I'm going to try these other things. I'll try these. Finally, she's like, okay, I'm going to do it. And she did it. And I was like, it'll take about 3 months, but within 3 months, if it's going to happen, this is when it's going to happen. Right.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
Realistically, she forgot that I had said 3 months. Right. But I know because like I helped her
Yeah.
decide today. And she called me up. I was like, look it's 3 months. She's like, oh my God, I totally forgot that you said it was going to be 3 months. And it's because of just working with the body. Also, ironically, it's also working with the moon. So along this time, I've started really paying attention to what the moon cycles are and what that actually means on the body. Because there's all this misinformation about, oh, it means this, it means that. And if you,
I'm really interested in that. Yeah.
yeah, because all life on this planet has evolved to handle the radiation of the sun, right? So whether you're a day dweller, a night dweller, at the bottom of the ocean, right? It doesn't matter where you are as far as a life species, you have to handle the radiation of the sun. Like somehow, some way, your body, your form has to deal with it. And at the full moon, there's more radiation being sent back down to the earth. And so,
Really? Okay.
yeah. And so across species, in particular, across mammalian species, for day-dwelling mammalian species, they have heightened cortisol. And in fact, the males have lower testosterone at the full moon, right? And so I started finding, like, try to see, like, has anyone else done the research? Hormones, like, come on, like, if I had this idea, someone else has probably had this idea. And eventually I
Yeah.
came across some different research. Now, they're not some, like, there's a couple really good studies that are huge sample sizes, but there's some that are smaller. But I'll still take the some that are smaller because at least there's a pattern there to start kind of playing off of. And it coincided with the what I had been documenting for the last couple of years as I was
Yeah.
kind of being like, is this actually what's happening? Because I started noticing these patterns that were kind of, I thought it was just the females and the cycles and, tracking that. But then my male clients often were having some of the same things coming up in their life and the same kind of
Oh, yeah.
responses to stuff. And I was like, there's got to be something, obviously that's,
Yeah.
it's got to be something else. And so I started like kind of tracking it with the moon and was like, oh, there's definitely a thing. And then I started, just putting it together like, oh, wait, yeah, there's more radiation at the full moon and there's less radiation, the least amount during the new moon. And then there's the balance in between. And so depending on where you are. So if you know that and you start like using the energy of like the earth and the moon, I know it's so silly, but it sounds silly, like, because my scientific mind still wants to be very like allopathic.
Tell me what you mean by how you use it. Like, when you say use the energy, what do you mean by that?
No, like you plan your work in your life around what is going to be happening to you physically. So like, if you know you're going to be having more cortisol, that's actually, that's like, you're going to have this extra boost of energy because that's actually kind of what's happening is like your body's taking in the extra radiation. So it has to utilize it. And so your body's going to make more cortisol to be able to handle the extra radiation. So you actually don't have to your body doesn't have to make as much cortisol like from stress. Like, I don't know, like it's not being made from stress. It's
Yeah,
being
well, that makes sense. Like, it is a
right?
full moon today. Like right now, it's a full
Exactly.
moon. So you're saying on a full moon, we naturally would have more cortisol, which would make us more, well, I mean, it's more energetic. I mean,
exactly.
Like, yeah.
And more norepinephrine. And like, there's a few other things. So like acetylcholine, it's at the peak during the first quarter. And dopamine is at the peak in the third quarter, and melanin is at the peak in the new moon, and the cortisol is at the peak at the full moon. Serotonin also at the peak at the full moon.
Okay.
And so when you start realizing that, so like it's rare to actually have cortisol and serotonin. If you think about like what's going on in your body, you wouldn't normally have cortisol and serotonin, at high production levels, right?
Okay.
And so, but they are at the full moon. And so if you use that knowing like, okay, I'm going to act like I'm going to ovulate on the full moon and I'm going to support myself as if I'm going to ovulate on the full moon, because it's when you actually get the most energetic support, like literally energetic support. Ideally, when you're healthy, you actually cycle on the new moon. And if you're cycling towards the first quarter, you need more estrogen. And if you're cycling towards the third quarter, you need more dopamine.
This seems like groundbreaking information, Wendy. Like, do you use this in your coaching, do you, for with women? And I think that's really amazing because there's a woman in Australia, but she works with women globally. Some of your listeners might know her. Her name is Jane Hardwick Collins. She's an Instagram, Jane Hardwick Collins. She's in her late 60s. I don't know exactly, but she does a lot of work with women around those transitional times, puberty and so menarche and then matriarch. And then she calls it, I forget, she has a word for like the menopausal stage, which she says, and I've done some of her workshops online. She says that after menopause, you're more in alignment with the moon than ever before. And you still have the same cycle. Even if you're not bleeding, you still have that cycle of the same cycle in terms of your mood and your energy levels and that you should optimally go into that new moon, full moon cycle where you have your most creative energy on your full moon and etc. So, but you're saying that you use that in order to facilitate women to start ovulating again or to get their
Yeah.
periods back. Yeah.
Yeah, get
That's
them back
really
on track.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
And
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah, and it's been really interesting. So like there's just so much your body's like giving you so much information. And so, those studies that say, okay, women don't cycle on the moon and they do or don't. But if you look, a woman's average cycle is a moon cycle, right? It's still
Yes.
aligned with the
Yes.
moon.
Yes.
And that's because,
Yeah.
your body's gonna be different than my body. But like say you're depleting in estrogen. Well, you're gonna be cycling around the first quarter all the time. And if you're really stressed out, you're going to be cycling out the full moon,
Yeah.
right? And if you're
Yeah.
more balanced, you're going to be cycling at the new moon. And
Yeah.
if you're ADHD, you're probably around the third moon, somewhere between the full and the new moon, depending on where you're at, right?
Yeah.
Well, because you need the progesterone, right?
Yeah.
And it's just like I've just been tracking it now for a couple of years,
Yeah.
like just on my own. Going, oh, that's interesting.
I
in
think it's
conversation
I
with
think it's
friends,
phenomenal.
people.
I think I'm glad that you have that you work with that actively, and I'd love to see. Yeah, I mean it sounds like it sounds like secret information that no one knows about that we should all know about,
Right? It's kind of so like Yoni's yarn
Women's
ring.
business.
Like Yoni's yarn ring is an ancient
Yes. Well, that's
tactic
it. Yeah.
that like people knew that they needed, just like like, hey, do you need a massage? That's right. Like you're a little
Yeah.
stressed. Hey, relax for a minute. Here, take care of your, drink this tea for your circulation. Right. Like we
Yeah.
have all of these remedies to help ourselves, but it's like
Yeah.
right over the last, few thousand years, it's like, oh, your genitals. No.
Yeah. I know, right?
Like, no, like we're now going to ignore that entire body part. Like that.
I know, it's crazy. Like all of these massive muscle groups that you can only access through, genitalia that just also have their contraction and need release, and
Yeah.
like
And so
parts of the goads you can only get to inside the vagina. Like I know it's
Yeah.
crazy, but
yeah, exactly. And so, like the moon is kind of like that too. I mean, we can go back through history, like we can see why this all happened. And I don't think anyone agrees that it was a good thing, but this is where we're at. And so now it's about getting out and, talking about it and, starting to bridge, like my goal is trying to start to bridge that gap between like spirituality, woo, and the science and be like, actually, there's real science to back this up. So
yeah.
indigenous practices have been using the moon for, since humans have been in existence, basically, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And so now there's some science to actually show why these work. And that's all,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, interesting. Like I'm totally open to, I'm just totally open to changing my mind or seeing things differently. I had been feeling like I'm glad that the whole period thing is over, and I feel so much better than I did 6 months ago, and I'm not having any of those symptoms anymore. I feel really even. Just even. I feel happy. Like I was getting really depressed as well because of like the whole toll it takes on your brain, and as you say, the dopamine. And now I'm feeling great. There are changes. Like my libido is definitely different. But for me, it's a positive thing because I feel like for a lot of my adult life, my libido's been like super distracting, and now it feels like I can harness it just in relationship and dynamic, and it's enough, and everything is great in that area. But I'm not like going through my day and week being totally distracted all the time by my libido. So they're positive developments. So I'm not certain that I would say, oh, I want to reverse it or go back to bleeding again. But I don't know. I feel like I don't even understand it enough. I don't understand what that means. Like maybe, there's a way to bleed again and not go through that hectic, precipitous drop in hormones, which causes all these incredible symptoms.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
I think so. In my research, and trying to figure out like, okay, what societies is menopause really not a big deal? Right. So
Yeah.
there are some, right, where
Yeah.
the women don't struggle. They just one day they, like they're, oh, I haven't bled in a long time. I guess I'm menopause, right? It's just
Yeah.
it's a natural transition. And so I kind of
Mhm.
looked into some of, like lifestyle, is it this? I think there's an element, it's definitely so much about lifestyle. And it honestly, so everything in our body is tied to whether you're stressed or not stressed. It's ridiculous how
Yeah, stress
simple
is
it
the
is,
thing. Yeah, it's
you
true.
know?
Yeah.
And it's just, there's kind of only two states of your body, and everything else revolves around that. You're either awake or you're not awake, and either you're stressed or you're not stressed. And depending on, which of those two levers are on, depends on the rest. Everything else depends on that. And once you
Yeah.
switch that lever, the awake, not awake, we need to go to sleep. Most people will keep that lever, going, right? Like I know
Yeah.
some really drastic sleep problems, but they're really tied to the stress part. Um, but once
Mhm.
you start really working with that, I feel safe in my body. What does my body need to feel safe? And not necessarily thinking about stress, but just what do I need right now to feel safe? What do I need right now
I
to feel at peace?
Yeah, I
What I
love that. Yeah,
Yeah.
bring it back to safety. That's a really great way of doing it. I mean, stress is just it is the modern disease of our time, isn't it?
Mhm.
Like it's
Yeah.
it's the number one cause of almost any illness, disease, and our lives, just the way we've created our society with just capitalism and, et cetera, et cetera. It's difficult to see how we can, I mean, we all should be doing things not to be stressed, but the very nature of the world we live in is stressful. So it's like you're constantly having to negotiate with, the status quo and find ways to have a little bubble of peace inside a world which is quite stressful. And I think that's um it's such a challenge, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure
Yeah.
you see that in your work a lot. Like I get a lot of clients who are like, how can I learn to be happy inside of, and then they name the situation, which is so horrible. It's so stressful that you just kind of go, well, you need to get rid of that, but then you understand for a lot of people, there's that part that's non-negotiable. Like that's your job, that's your life, that's your marriage, that's your blah, blah, blah. How do I come to some sense of peace and stillness within a situation which is innately horrible? I don't know that I have an answer for that. What do you say?
This is this is at the heart of the work that I do.
Yeah.
And it's all tied together. Like all
Yeah.
so for people who are watching, listening, who maybe are new to me or maybe found me in a different avenue. So I'm an orgasm neuro pleasure coach, also a business coach for solo entrepreneurs with ADHD. Also do psychedelic microdosing, and a trauma informed coaching. So all of those things kind of come together. And really,
Multi-passionate is the word,
yeah,
right? Multi-passionate. Yeah.
I'm a multifaceted individual with
Yeah.
multifaceted interests, right? Um, but at the heart of it is this idea of safety. And that's something that became really, really clear to me a couple years ago. And, you know, a little bit of background about my life. That I have two kids. Lots of other people have kids too. My younger son is disabled. Other people have disabled kids too. But anyone who is in that knows that just, it gets stressful. It just gets stressful sometimes just living life. Even if you don't have kids, our life is just stressful. And because of my circumstances, I didn't necessarily have the time to, go on the retreats and spend, hours at the
Yeah.
gym, or
Self-nurturing.
like a lot of an hour meditating or, these different mechanisms that were like they're great. They work. Like they really do work to help you feel better in your body, but they weren't really conducive to my life. So I had to
Yeah.
learn how to first like find these different like kind of tools and tips and tricks. But then what I realized it all boiled down to is kind of getting in the practice of checking in and be like, what do I actually need right now to feel safe? And in that, because it changes from moment to moment, right?
Yeah.
Uh, sometimes I just need to take a breath. Sometimes I just need to be like, okay, I'm gonna put my headphones on. Like, I don't know, like, what I'm gonna need, but like just those moments of checking in and stopping and having,
Yeah.
that dialogue with yourself is a skill that most people didn't have. I didn't have. Sure as hell did not
Yeah.
grow up
Yeah.
with any internal dialogue. So, I mean,
Checking in is
the crazy
massive.
thing,
Yeah, checking
yeah,
in is massive, yeah, and getting into a habit, as you say, of doing it all the time. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And with that comes this awareness and like as you keep checking in and as you keep creating safety with yourself, it like builds on each other. You like consistently builds. And I do not stress out nearly the way I used to because I know I can create safety for myself. Like
Yeah,
I don't need the external circumstances to change in order to feel good in my body anymore.
yeah.
I know how to make myself feel good in my body. And it's for me, it's life changing, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah, I
so
mean,
with it,
that's the most important thing.
mhm, yeah. Um, Now going kind of back to all this conversation, learning
Mm,
these things, I think has extended my period. Like I know it's extended my period because,
yeah.
according to the doctors, I was going to be, like in early menopause, right? And clearly I'm not. um, and just even thinking about whether you're in menopause or not, these practices, our bodies still know, like we do still produce estrogen, not just from our ovaries, right? Estrogen
Yeah.
is estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone are necessary hormones for natural biological processes. And
Yeah.
even without your reproductive organs, if you're healthy, well-being, basically safe or not safe, stressed, not stressed, right? If you are not stressed or you're feeling safe, then your body can produce the necessary hormones to be protective.
Yes, yes. And I think that's the key is somehow finding the balance, and I would love that to be more kind of the conversation that we're having as women and and in the medical world and the holistic world about menopause is how can we move into an age and a stage where we still have all the protective benefits of estrogen and we're healthy, but we also have the benefits of menopause. And there are benefits, and not just, everyone says, oh, thank goodness I'm not bleeding, but it's far beyond that. Like your hormonal profile changes. So, for example, you're more testosterone dominant and it changes the organization of neural pathways in your brain. There's a book that I've been reading. I'll just name it because I've got it on my Kindle. Um, and it's called The Menopause Brain. You've probably heard of it.
Well,
I think it's a bestseller, The Menopause Brain by Lisa Mosconi, and it talks a lot about how the brain changes, and there are lots of positive things like women. She uses this language of women are more in control of their emotions, which I really like. That makes my body constrict. Like I don't like this idea, like the control of emotions is a good thing, but I think reading behind the languaging of it, there's more of a conceptual distance between reactivity and that like awareness of what's actually happening. And I think that's really helpful. And I can see that in myself. I'm much less likely to be lost in my own reactions and more likely to go, hang on, like what's actually happening here, which is different from repressing it. I'm still feeling it. And, like when you work with trauma, like number one rule, don't repress your feelings. But so there are benefits. So yeah, like I'd love to have that conversation more, see that out there in the public space going forward. How can we go into this stage and still have all the benefits of menopause, which are, and some people say menopausal women should rule the world. And Lisa Mosconi makes a good case for that because
mhm,
of the brain chemistry and how there's this combination of nurturing and emotional availability, but also this dispassionate aspect of being able to see things how they are and make decisions for the collective. That's one of the things she really emphasizes, like women able to make decisions for the good of all and not just in a more hyper masculine way of being like, I'm just driven towards success and domination, which is, by the way, obviously different from males. It's more of a archetypal, you
right.
know, pattern, that hyper masculine. And I feel like I'm coming into that, I'm finding it, but I'm totally interested in any of the research around how that happens. Cause you're right. We never stop making estrogen. Like we'll have it till the day we die. It's not like you lose it completely. It's just the combinations change. And obviously you
Right.
don't
So
ovulate anymore.
going back to that stress cycle, right?
Mm.
If you are making too much cortisol, you're using your testosterone to start the removal of the cortisol, which then turns into the toxic form of estrogen that I don't remember exactly the name for.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so then your body's not making as much estrogen. And now you
Yeah.
don't have the reproductive organs to pull from. And so that's where the health concerns come from. It's not that you're in menopause. It is the fact that if you are still making more cortisol, if you're not working with your cortisol production and understanding your cortisol production and working with the balance of your body. Because the reason I'm bringing that up in particular, because when you go into menopause, you now shift into the same cortisol production cycles that males do, which is a 24-hour cycle. But even though you're on that 24-hour cycle, it's still impacted by the moon, right? So it's
Yeah. I
this
was about
24.
to say, it comes back to the moon, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And so understanding that just because you had a good week last week and trying to do this is the productive society model that is not very beneficial for society at whole. We will have good days and bad days while especially as women, it's a little bit difficult to find the rhythm sometimes when you're trying to kind of fit yourself into a masculine model of cortisol production, right?
Yeah.
Where they can wake up in the morning and it's like a new cycle again. So instead of them having the monthly menstrual cycle guiding their hormones, it resets every day, right? But there's still the moon influence, just as a reminder. And so if you're trying to fit into that same like reset cycle every single day, you're trying to construct your days with this idea that tomorrow's going to be the same as it was today, which is the same as yesterday. That's absolutely not true.
Yeah.
And so where I think the idea like women in menopause have an advantage is that we still understand, whether or not we even realize it, we still understand the cycle of the moon because we've been living it our whole life. Right. And so we can actually flow into the natural rhythm of the earth and find our rhythm easier than men because they're not taught how to work with the cycle. They're not taught how to do this. We've lost the traditions of the indigenous traditions that with the moon that they would have had naturally learned through their life growing up, like they would experience the different cycles and when months were, when the things were, you do certain things at the full moon because that's what the full moon provides. That animals are out and about. And so you can do night hunts. You don't do that on new moon because the animals are all hiding. So you would never go out on a new moon. And you would know that if you grew up in that, right? And you would know that for yourself. You would know that you would want to be back at camp, at home with your family.
Yeah, I love this. This really inspires me actually to pay more. I mean, I have been told, like, I guess I need to be told things a few times, like most humans. I have been told, like, get into the cycle of the moon. I know Jane Hardwick Collins says that a lot, but I'm very inspired now by this conversation to go actually sit down. I mean, I know today is a full moon.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
But and so this is how I would suggest, start with a full moon practice and a new moon practice. Like find one that resonates for you for a full moon practice. There's so many, there's so many beautiful practices, like so many amazing witchy women have been discovering and sharing and transforming and adapting, these different traditions and you'll find one. So whether or not, you've got ancestral roots that you feel called to, or, you just really like different tradition, because you feel drawn to it, whatever, go with what feels good. Find a full moon to start practicing with and find a new moon to start practicing with. And make them be different, make sure that they're different things because you'll start noticing what shows up around the full moon and you'll start noticing what shows up around the new moon. It's just the easiest way to start noticing your own rhythm without it having to be like this hard, oh, what am I going to do to keep track of everything? And right.
Yeah. So for the full moon, so the energy is more like, I get that it's higher and more energy, but I always get confused. Like, so you plant the seeds on the new moon, you plant the seeds of new desires. And I understand that on the full moon, it's supposed to be like kind of like reaping what you sow, but I don't understand
Or,
practically what
you
that means in
know,
terms
what's
of ritual.
what's interesting, you plant the seeds for outward growth on the new moon, and
Hmm.
you plant the seeds for grounded growth at the full moon. So like if you were actually to do a garden and plant a garden, so if you're planting crops that grow up,
Yeah.
that you're going to be harvesting, you plant on the new moon. So
Okay.
that way it grows up towards the full moon. If you're
Right.
doing root vegetables or things that actually go from the ground, you plant on the full moon.
Oh,
So
do you? That's
Mhm.
interesting. Okay. So what does
Yeah,
that mean in terms of like goals? So on the full
right.
moon, would be more like working
All right.
and then
So
contemplating.
I'm gonna start with the new moon, and we're gonna go around so that way, like,
Okay.
makes
Yeah, I
like
love it. Yeah,
great.
let's do it. Yeah.
All right. So on the new moon, I'd like to pick a theme for the month, ideally to make it easier. At least I find it easier to follow the zodiac sign, like where the sun is or the moon is, like
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
pick that. It's just easier.
Yeah.
Like, cause then you can find so many different resources, to
Yeah, yeah.
follow along. Um,
Okay.
and so you pick the theme, kind of for what you want to kind of bring into fruition and focus on.
Mhm.
And what is happening then? And so it's the darkness. It's all kind of like you're going to be introspective, like really noticing what's internally, right? Like your
Yeah.
internal.
Yeah.
And then as there's starting to be light, you're going to start noticing the behaviors and the things that maybe you want to change and shift. And as
Yeah.
you get to the full moon, you're going to have an awareness of the things that are not working for you. Right.
Yeah.
But also you can have an awareness of the things that are working for you. It just sheds light on whatever the situation is. And so ideally, this is when acetylcholine is at its high, at the peak is at the first quarter. And this is
Yeah.
when you learn. So like if you're going to want to be practicing and learning and creating the new habits that are going to support whatever your goal is. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then as you move over into the full moon, this is when you're really practicing them and like solidifying them. And then
Mm.
as you start to shift into the third quarter, this is actually when, so you're at high cortisol right here. So it is a little more like you've got energy and you've got
Yeah.
like, but it's also in serotonin's there, but that starts to go down. So your serotonin
Yeah.
starts to go down. So there's a little bit of like uneasiness that starts to creep in a little bit. And
Yeah.
it's also because you're coming into balance. So at first quarter and third quarter, you're in balance, and most people's nervous system is not balanced and they will notice it. And so your nervous system wants to be the most balanced at first quarter and third quarter, right?
Okay.
And when it's not, like whatever your dysregulation is, your body's going to try to get to that equilibrium. So
Okay.
this is when especially on the third quarter, this is when your bad habits are going to be totally in full effect, right? And
Ah.
this is why the moon also gives you that extra dopamine boost. So that way you can actually have a little more focus on the things that you actually want to do, right? You can be aware of the bad habits that are trying to creep in and actually
Yeah.
maybe be a little more targeted with what you're doing. It's
Yeah.
interesting how the moon completely supports you through this whole process.
I love this so much. I need it to be in a workbook format. I don't know if you have one, but I need a workbook that I can like work with. And I tell you what, like since being so menopausal, I've noticed, it's really popular right now to have like period coaches and to work with your menstrual cycle. And it makes me feel like, oh, like that time of my life has passed. Like I can't work with my menstrual cycle anymore. Oh my gosh, my daughter can.
Yeah.
Great for her, she's 18. But now I'm feeling like I can. I
Mhm.
can work with the moon. So I feel like we really need this, Wendy. Like I really need a workbook just focused on like working with the moon cycles, just whether or not you're, still menstruating or not. Like either way it works because yeah, like it totally makes sense. I really like the idea of how it's as the moon is, I guess, waxing, it's shining the light on what works and what doesn't work. And
Mhm.
probably around the full moon, you're making some big decisions around that. Like, it's funny because like this morning I woke up and I was like, you know what? I've got an ad for a particular thing. I'm like, kill the ad. It's not working. And I, and I emailed my digital marketing guy. I'm like, I've been thinking about it overnight. And I'm like, just kill that ad for me. Let's focus on this. And that makes so much sense.
Yep. This is what I'm
Everything you're
saying. Like,
doing.
this is what I was saying. Like, there were certain
Yeah.
patterns that I saw, and like, it wasn't just the women that were cycling. It was like the men were doing this too. And it was consistent. And I'm like,
Yeah. Okay, I am gonna really nag you to make this because I think that we all need this. Like, I need it and we all need it. And yes, you need to create like,
okay.
yeah, yeah. I love it.
All
I
right.
love it so much.
It will.
I need it. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool.
And I think like, and for me, yeah, I'm going to do this. I'm like, I
I
actually really do want to
honestly,
focus on the menopause book because there are certain things that should be the focus that we pay attention to that maybe we're not setting aside the time because we don't even necessarily know how to focus on the things we need to focus on. So I like this.
yeah. And I mean, maybe it's something, I mean, it probably would appeal to all women. I mean, maybe particularly women who like are entrepreneurs who have their own business because we're much more in our cycle because we're kind of more dictating our hours and like how the movement is.
Mhm.
But I mean, it'd be helpful for everyone. But I think for me
Yeah.
especially, I'm feeling, yeah,
It's so interesting when you said that. It like triggered something that I remembered I wanted to say earlier. I have this client who he's in his mid 70s, late 70s, somewhere in there. And we were recently having a conversation and I was saying something. He's like, Wendy, he's like, let me tell you, between 50 and 70 is the most creative years. He's like, you've got all this wisdom and you kind of just don't care what other people think. You know what you're doing to some extent. Like you're not just constantly seeking approval. He's like, and it
I
just
mean,
allows
yeah,
opportunity to open up and create. And I have been sitting with that. I'm like,
yeah.
God, what if that was just a message for menopause? Like, look at
I love that so
now.
much. Like, I mean, you must feel, I totally feel that way. And I mean, I'm just about to hit my 50th birthday. I'm super excited. You know what? Jane Hardwick Collins, this menopause, whatever, female cycle, I don't know what she calls herself, expert. She calls estrogen the hormone of accommodation. And she says one of the signs that you're going through it is all the things that estrogen helps you accommodate, and it helps you nurture. It's like the hormone where you're nurturing, you're planting seeds, you're nurturing your career, you're nurturing your children. But as a female bodied, as you're creating this estrogen, it's like giving you this urge to nurture. And once that starts to drop, and your testosterone is more relatively high, you kind of wake up, she describes it, from this fog and go like, I don't have time for this. Like, why am I doing all the work? And that is 100%, like 1,000% my experience. And I mean, partly, I've got 3 kids, 2 are adults, but I've got 3 stepchildren. There are a lot of kids around me. And I've said so many times to my partner, I am not available for more housework and shopping and cooking. I'm not available. Like, I am obviously in some circumstances to help out, but just generally my whole body is saying like, I am really available to myself right now, and my needs are the most important thing. My health, my well-being, my career. I've already grown my children. I'm like completely about me, and I'm just not available to looking after other people as much. So I love
Yeah.
that, the hormone of accommodation.
Yeah. It's kind of like tying, I'm like, I love this conversation, but
Yeah.
so much. Um, just thinking about why women, like menopausal women, really should be more prominent. If you think about it, so now maybe we're not quite as accommodating, but we are still producing estrogen. And now we have all the experience of being nurturing, we have the practice. So we don't have to develop these new ways of being. We already just are. They're an essence of our being.
Yeah.
And now we get on that more societal productive cycle of the 24-hour period. And if you learn how to work with the moon and that together, like,
Oh,
And if you're taking a menopausal woman who is doing those practices to create safety in her body, she's not going to be as stressed, which means she's going to have more estrogen available to be accommodating in a kind and loving way without that other kind of signaling to like take care of everyone and neglect herself, right? Like it's going
Yeah,
to be a more
yeah,
balanced
yeah.
estrogen,
You
right?
lose the
Mar-
martyrdom. You lose the
yeah.
martyrdom, I think, yeah. And that's also another thing that happened for me is, like, there's this anger that came out of nowhere. Like, I had this period where I was so angry, I'd have to, like, take myself out of the house, and anger has never been my keynote emotion. Like, I feel like we all tend to have our keynote emotion, like our go-to. For me, it was more like maybe self-pity and tears and, poor me and all of that. Like, that was more my comfort zone. And so when anger came up, I was like, what do I do with this beast? It's like, it's just deadly. It's just coming out of me. And it was that part of me that was like, I'm done with accommodating others. Like, I need to have a boundary and put myself first. But the way that it came out was this incredible anger, which I had to learn how to manage. And so it happened over a period of a couple years, and it was just like every few months I'd have a little period of like intense anger, and then it would, but I learned a lot from that anger, actually.
Yeah. Um, yeah, all of our emotions are super important. And I mean, you know that
Yeah.
they have a place, and they're, they're, the more I understand about how it kind of all works, like our body's always talking to us in a beautiful, like it's a beautiful way. We have our mind and we have our
Mm,
body, and they don't speak the same language. Like the operating system of the body is different than the operating system of the mind. But
yeah.
emotions are the way that the body communicates with the mind.
Yeah.
And it's not a judgmental thing. It's a, hey, this is what's happening in my body. And
Yeah.
once we learn how to allow that, to be present with that, and also simultaneously not get too trapped in it, right? Because it's just your body saying, hey, this is what's happening and needs attention. Please address it. Not, I'm gonna be this way forever. Right? Because
Exactly.
I see this a lot with it, like all for the anger thing, all for the leaning into your sadness, all for the leaning into whatever emotion you're experiencing. But you're not meant to live there. All of these emotions are supposed to be
Absolutely. Yeah.
temporary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Emotions are like, I see them like, they're like, storms or clouds moving through the sky. You
Yeah.
have to like be in it while it's happening, but let it go. It's meant to pass. Like, you'll get bored of it. You're not, yeah, as you say, you're not meant to be in it enough
Yeah.
all the time, rather. Yeah. I mean, what I see as well, like in terms of like emotions and feelings and being with them, the thing that I see the most often, the piece that's missing in my clients is that compassion for self. Like, it's just being able to hold yourself as you would hold a small child and really be compassionate. And so I see people who've done heaps of work, they're super self-aware. They might even be comfortable being uncomfortable, comfortable holding or expressing or moving through those feelings, but what they're not able to do is just take a moment and extend that compassion for self and really just, you know, be there for themselves. And that to me is the most transformative piece of the whole like somatic awareness, emotional processing thing, is to be compassionate. And I think, fortunately, I'd learned that before going through this hormonal transition. So I didn't judge myself too harshly for when I felt, out of control with my emotions or anger or reactions. I was able to do it. And I think that's made a huge difference, to how I'm feeling now. But yeah, it's important.
Yeah. I agree. That's definitely one of the the pillars, or, I don't call them pillars, but it's definitely one of the components of what I when I work with people too. I think it is an often missing piece, right?
Yeah.
Um, Especially my somatic practitioners. Sometimes they have some of the worst self-talk. Like the people
Yeah,
that done so much work.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Yeah. I mean, I think we can get caught up in the nervous system. I mean, I often say one of my things is like the nervous system currently is the star of the trauma drama because we know so much more about the nervous system than we ever have in the history of the world. And neuroscience has completely kind of got into all the deep crevices of our understanding of trauma, which is brilliant because we understand like the body keeps the score. We understand it so well, but what it can create is a lot of clients, you probably see it too, who are like, and then my amygdala does this, and I know I'm in panic or fight and flight, or I've read this, or Stephen Porges and my vagus nerve, and it's like like there is also parts theory, or with the shamanic tradition, like dissociated or parts of your soul that are broken off. But there are parts of us who are just vulnerable and in pain and need us to turn to them and greet them with compassion and love. It's not just the nervous system. So as much as I love all of these scientific developments, it's also giving people a language which helps them dissociate from their own self-care and compassion. And why it's so difficult is that often if you have a trauma background, I mean, where do we learn compassion? We learn it through the mirror of our parents. That's where we learn it. We learn it through the mother's soft gaze and that holding and the body contact and the kissing and oh, like you've hurt yourself. I'm so sorry, sweetie. All of that loving care. And if we don't have that, I mean, this is me because my clients are mostly, survivors of childhood abuse situations. If we don't have that learning, we don't know. We're like, it's like, what's compassion? What do you mean care? So you have to relearn it. So I'm not surprised it's a missing thing, but it is, and I feel like that's again, like if I could wave my magic wand, the conversation around menopause would include all these beautiful moon-based self-care, like the power and the gift as well as this. And if I could wave my magic wand around trauma, it would be let's hold the nervous system in one hand and let's hold compassion in the other because they go together. That's not a separate journey. It has to be together.
Yeah. Like the body's a component. So I talk about the 5 major energy systems of your being. So there's the physical, which is your body, right? Like that includes your nervous system, your brain, your organs, your fascia, all the stuff, right? Like what you can see through time and space. And then you have the mental, which is the mind. Everyone knows your mind is separate from the body. So it's connected, but it's a different, it's separated. Yeah. And then you have the emotional energy system, which resides in the fascia. Remember I said this is like how the body talks to the mind. And so even it's like, it's both. It's a part of the body and it's a part of the mind, right? It's like but really what the mind does is interprets the sensations of the body, the emotions, and then makes sense of it. And then makes the story up around it about what that means for them. And you have those 3 parts. And then you have the spiritual part, which I kind of have 2 ways to explain this. So if you want to do just like using language, maybe traditional, indigenous, spiritual, shamanic, ways, you have that spiritual part where if you get quiet, it's the higher, wiser self. On a biological basis, I can also explain it too. When you get into a state that allows you to have that kind of wisdom, that higher wisdom, higher self come through, you're not stressed. You feel safe. And have switched into different, remember I was like, you're either safe or not safe. And when you do that, different parts of your brain turn on. And so it allows for a different way of thinking and being. And so it's a different energy than a stressed energy, right? And so understanding that you need to, when you're stressed, you cannot connect to that spiritual energy, that spiritual part of self, that part that looks at an experience afterwards and is like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. Right?
Yeah.
That part is not accessible when you're stressed, right? So however you want to use it and whatever methods or tools you want to use to get there, they're all they all work. They all basically do the
Yeah.
same thing. It's just whichever works for your body and feels good for you with your background and your knowledge and your life
Mhm.
experiences, your
Yeah, I
physical.
love that.
Yeah,
You have to meet people where they're at. I mean, there's an explanation, as you say, for that, whether it's spiritual or nervous system. It doesn't actually, the language doesn't actually matter because it's an experience we're going for anyway.
exactly. And then the last, that was four, and the fifth energy system is social. And this one gets overlooked, but it's, in my opinion, it's probably one of the most important parts because
Ah,
we as humans, I mean, I know you know this, so I'm just going to be repeating stuff you
yeah,
already
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
As babies, we learn how to regulate our nervous system by the caregivers around us. We are mammals. This is what mammals do. Mammals
Mm.
entrain with the other mammals around them. They co-regulate their nervous system. So this is protective. It can go in multiple directions. It can make us feel safe. It can also bring us into action. Like if
Yeah.
your mom or say you're sitting around the campfire as a society, like say go back tribal days, and someone comes running in and it's the quote unquote crazy one, right? Where you're like, okay, he's just being crazy, right? You don't necessarily regulate with him. But when, the person who is at the fence guarding it comes in and is in heightened awareness, your nervous system will immediately entrain. And it's protective, right? So
Yeah,
we
interesting.
entrain with the people who are the ones in charge. Like that's just naturally what we do. And it's not always like the parent, sadly. Right? Sometimes it's the child that's actually regulating, the
Yeah.
parent. And so so kind of knowing that when you work with someone or you put yourself in situations with other people who have regulated nervous systems, you learn to regulate. And there's just so many different ways to do this. This is like, there's, as many different ways as there are people on this planet, you
Yeah,
know?
which is why group work is so helpful and important because when you're in a group, you can benefit from that group entrainment, as you say.
Exactly. So I know,
Yeah.
especially group work where, especially if you get yourself really, kind of dysregulated, like you do maybe an anger thing or, a trauma, like the different modalities that like actually get you dysregulated. And then you practice coming back into regulation. It's almost irrelevant what you're doing.
Yeah.
What the real benefit is learning that practice of getting dysregulated and coming back to regulation. And whichever modality speaks to you is the one you should
Yeah.
do.
Um, I love that. So I haven't quite heard that. So getting dysregulated together and regulating together.
Mhm. Yeah.
Hmm.
That teaches you more than talking.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's so many things that work more than talking.
Yeah. Um, I'm not discrediting the talking though, because we still have that you have to also work with mind. You can't ignore the
Yeah.
mind.
Can't ignore it. And you need to be heard and you need to receive
Yeah,
empathy and have your story told and all of that. But yeah, but
exactly.
you know how it is. You don't want to be just talking for 30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I love that
Ideally,
notion of
yeah. Like ideally you're working with like these different systems together and feeling and getting to experience it and release energy and get that regulation and all the things. And to me, that's
yeah.
it.
I haven't heard it put in quite those terms, but there is a great book on trauma from a Australian psychologist who studied groups, like group therapy in Aboriginal settings in Australia. And I can't, it's the word trauma's in it. I'll email it to you and you can put it in the show notes if you like. But it's a really interesting study because what she shows is that in these Aboriginal communities, as you would expect, people heal more profoundly, more deeply, and have a longer lasting, outcomes, positive outcomes when they work together as a group. And she just facilitates groups that to some degree mirror how indigenous communities would process group trauma. So you have the person who's gone through trauma and there's a sense of being held and seen
Mm.
and heard and having them tell their stories in a group. And there's a lot more to the book. It's a lot of interesting analysis, but it's one of my go-to books. Just really showcasing that power of that group experience and that dynamic of community. Community is a real buzzword lately, and I'm really glad that it's finally on the radar because we do really need community to heal. We really need community. And if we don't have that in our family, in our extended families, in our neighborhoods, we need to find ways to create it because it is also, as you say, I hadn't put it quite together with the way that you describe it, which is really beautiful about that dysregulation and regulation. But it does facilitate that kind of it almost disperses the way I conceptualize it is it kind of disperses the pain, so that you're not the only one holding it. Everyone is like energetically holding it for you, and it just kind of can dissolve it out of your body a little bit, in that group, which we don't get when we live these isolated lives all by ourselves. Which is why I think one of the things I'm fond of saying is, you know, like trauma healing is not just about what you do in that dyad. It's also about the art of living. And it's, healing, living is healing. And we need to have so many different things in our life for our healing other than just working with someone, which is, of course, very powerful, but also there are other things that are incredibly healing. And my favorite example of that is there are lots of surf programs in California and in Australia where they work with veterans with PTSD, and they teach them to surf as a way of helping them regulate their nervous system. And the outcomes are phenomenal with that. Just getting a bunch of people together with PTSD and getting them in the water and surfing and having fun. There's so many reasons why it works, but I think it's really beautiful because you know how it is. Like not everyone is going to want to talk or want to see, a therapist or a coach or one-on-one. But yeah, there are other ways. And I think with that, like the surf programs, it's partly that experience of surfing, which is its own particular thing, but it's also that community and that group activity.
Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah. And talking, I mean, I'm a fan of talking.
I am too. I love it. And I love clients who want to tell me their story. I'm totally down for that. Like I can really hold it. And it's important, sometimes people have never fully just said what they're dealing with, but that's not all there is. So yeah.
Exactly. It's, as it's like what you said, meaning the people where they're at, right? And it's about being honest and kind of going back to like, okay, what do I actually need to feel safe? I need to work with someone who isn't going to make me feel like I'm broken, right? So one of the issues I have had in finding people that I like, I mean, I found people I like to work with, but oftentimes, even as a coach that knows how important it is to work with a coach, I'm lucky I've got some good ones now, but it took me a while to find them because a lot of times I find people have that fixing energy, which is actually just a stress response, where they're uncomfortable with you not living life to their standards.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, I laugh because I so relate, it's interesting because this is like, I've started running a training program for practitioners on how to do soul-led trauma healing, like inviting the soul into the room rather than leaving it at the door kind of thing. And it's about like the training is about not what you do, like not your modality toolkit, like you might be a hypnotherapist or EFT. It's about the outside of the session. It's about the before and after, how you frame it, the space you hold. And that, there are 4 pillars, like we all have our pillars. But the first pillar really is that leaning in, and being available to hold that space. And like the way that I explain it to people is through contrast, because, contrast is, the best teacher ever, right? It's so hard sometimes to know what's good unless we understand why something doesn't work. But the reason that leaning in is so important is that I think largely exactly what you're saying. There's this energy that can permeate that dyadic relationship with a practitioner and a client where there's just this natural tendency to pathologize because already the dynamic is I'm the one who's a practitioner and you're the one who's broken. And there's this whole attitude like, I have these tools because I need to fix you. It's like we have to get back to the baseline, which isn't what soul-centered healing is about. In my view, it's an evolutionary thing. It's that whole thing of post-traumatic growth, right? It's evolutionary. It's you can get to a place where some things are better than before.
Mhm.
So yeah, I love that you say that. And it's great for people listening to understand that like that's not true. Like there is no brokenness. Like, you know, trauma it's the human condition, right? Like only in the past 100 and 20 years do we even understand the notion of trauma. Like, and that comes from that psychotherapeutic tradition where we started to go, oh, like people have these pathologies and what happened in their childhood with Freud and then Jung and all that. Like that's only so it's only in 120 years that we understand that there are ways of working with people who are suffering. But, through all of human history, what's the common experience of humanity is that people suffer. Like it used to be, you couldn't be a mother without experiencing loss. Like it was just very unlikely that you weren't going to lose a baby or yourself die or lose a female that you knew to childbirth, right? So, like, trauma is so incredibly normal. And I think that's the space we need to hold for, like, we are all to some extent trauma survivors, some in different ways than others, but that common humanity is so important. And, it's a shame. I'm
And
glad that you found people, but yeah, you're right. It's difficult because I think, yeah, with all the best intentions, people go into the healing profession because first we really need to figure out our own wounding. And that's not a disparaging remark because that's just human, right? And how beautiful that we want to help ourselves through helping other people. There is a purity of intention very often, but also like until you develop that awareness over time, there is this tendency to fix. And you know what? The
yeah,
training programs don't really make matters any better. Like I have to be honest. Like there's so many programs out there that are teaching practitioners who teach them like our method is like the only method and it's going to 100% fix all your problems in 1 to 3 sessions. And you can charge $1,000 per session. And it's like, wow, like that's not
yeah,
how humans work. And it's not, as like I'm sure it's not the things you do as a practitioner. It's the space you hold and who you are and your attitude and your paradigm and the rapport. Like rapport is huge, right? Like if you have rapport with someone, like the studies are really clear. It doesn't matter. They could tell you to wear a silly hat and chant a mantra and walk in a circle. If the rapport is good, you're going to shift.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
I will argue that rapport is nervous system regulation, right?
Yes.
So if you
Interesting.
think
Yeah.
about that fixing energy, it's
Mhm.
it's because the therapist or the practitioner is stressed about the other person's wounding or whatever
Yeah.
they're trying,
Yeah.
whatever they're
Triggered
trying to
by
work with,
it or they don't know
right?
how to handle it or yeah, yeah.
Whatever it is, like,
Yeah.
or it's their own stress, like, oh, I have to prove that I know what I'm doing. I have to prove
Yes.
that
Yes.
this method works. That's a lot of energy that I see, show
Mm.
up. The sadly, the imposter syndrome that so many people, have just in general, because
Yeah.
we all grow up feeling less than, and we don't value just our everyone's inherent worth of existing and
Yeah.
their existence in that moment being beneficial to
Yeah.
someone else, right? Like I think about this a lot with my younger son. So his disability, you know, never say never, like, but if you're gonna be like realistic, use past as, as evidence kind of thing, he's never gonna be a quote unquote productive member of society, right? And one would argue like, oh, what's the value in that? Right? Right? Like what's his value if he's not able to contribute to these ideas that people have of what a successful life is, or like this
Yeah.
notion, right? When
Mhm.
already in his 12 years, I have so many stories of how he's positively impacted people's lives.
Ah,
And I'm like, what's more
yeah.
productive than that? What's more beneficial to
Absolutely.
society than like, I mean, some of the stories they come to me in like these weird, weird ways. Like there was there's one, so I have two sons. So I have my older son who had a friend who was around my younger son and kind of learned a little bit about him and his disability and just like, oh, his brain works a little differently than other people, and just kind of realized
Yeah.
that happens sometimes. Like sometimes
Yeah.
people don't
Yeah.
act the way normal developing, people act, right? And there was a kid in his school that he's like, we found out later, right? So the mom called me up. I just have to tell you, I had a conversation with my son because apparently he like kept this kid from getting bullied by the teachers because he was like, hey, he just thinks a little differently.
Oh.
I was like, and when
Hmm.
she went to talk to her son about like why, like, oh, that was interesting, like where they come. It's like, oh, I remember Max. Max thinks differently sometimes. Right.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
Right. And so there's all these, there are all these beautiful things that happen just because you exist. Like whoever's watching this, listening right now, like I guarantee you, your existence has made other people extremely happy in ways that you have no idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a product. I mean, we're a product of our culture, and we're in a capitalist, consumerist, productivity obsessed culture where your worth is so tied to that. But that's just where we are in space and time. And other places in time, that's not the case. And I think, yeah, I think it's so healthy to start looking at our lives differently. And for me,
Mhm.
looking at it from a soul-based perspective really helps, because I think of it like, we've all come down and having this life, this human life, to have the experience of being human. And that's enough just to be Michelle and going about her life with her kids and her complications. And, like that is enough. Like it's the experience as souls we want, not the accolades, success, results, outcomes, things. It's the experience of like, recovering from suffering, or the experience of, having a child with a disability, or the experience of, et cetera, and often what it brings me back to is this beautiful thing that I heard about, there are a lot of monks, well, like particularly in India, who live in monasteries their whole life, from the time they're children, and they meditate all day and they live these very monastic lives. And this thing of like, what's the point of that? Like, they're not doing anything. And, the answer is that some people say, like, the monks, the nuns of the world, they're the trees of the planet energetically, like through their beingness, they're breathing and cleaning the energy and cleaning the air through us. And I just love that idea that they're the trees of the planet, and that I always bring that back to myself. When I have a moment where I'm like, I'm not productive enough, I go, hang on, like I am just a being, and just my energy, is transmuting something. If I can sit in that space of just compassion and love and just be myself in this moment, with whatever reaction I have, I'm also having an effect, just like these monks are the trees of the planet, breathing for us. I think that's really beautiful.
Mm, I love that so much. I'm gonna
Yeah.
take that with me. Uh, and on that note, I think if anyone wants to work with you and find you, how would they do that?
Well, I don't know. I have two websites. So if you're interested in working with me as a client because you're processing through like a trauma history, then it's Michelle-Dixon.com. I also work with practitioners doing that soul-led trauma practitioner training, and also some marketing for practitioners, and that's academyforhealers.com. But I'm sure Wendy will put that in the show notes. But yeah, there are options there.
Yay! Love it. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for this wonderful, deep conversation. um, if you
Thank
had
you.
any just like last closing thoughts, for that you want to leave, here, what would they be?
Last closing thoughts. I would just encourage anyone who's listened to all or part of the conversation to just pay attention to what jumped out for you, and take that and run with it, and go down that rabbit hole of whatever it is that sparked your attention, whether it was like the menopause, the moon stuff, the, being your authentic self experience. Yeah. Just, um, Yeah, pay attention to what jumps out for you. That's always how I operate because, like I listen to lots of things and it's always something I take away that leads me to the next thing. So, yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure.
It's been really fun. Yay. Thanks.
Thank you for joining for today's episode. I hope you found the conversation interesting, maybe even a little inspiring. And if you're curious about how to work with our guest today, check out the show notes because I'll have all the links and resources there. And if you're curious about how to work with me or what I offer, you can check out my website, wendygoesdeep.com, to learn more about what it is that I do. And I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you for a little favor. Growing this community is only possible with support from people like you. If you could take a moment to like, subscribe, or maybe even share it with a friend, it helps more than you know. And until we can go deep again, stay curious and keep exploring.